Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's a real out-of-body experience when I put Arthur Marx's JD's Revenge against Ernest Dickerson's Bones. And man, this was one real wild ride. First off, we got JD's Revenge, directed by Arthur Marx, who did a lot of staples of blaxploitation cinema like Detroit 9000, Friday Foster, and Bucktown. And this one stars Glenn Turman as a law student in New Orleans who, while he's out on the town with his girlfriend and another couple that they're friends with, they end up at this place where there's a hypnotist and he goes under hypnosis and then ends up possessed by this spirit of a hustler from 1942 who died, named J.D. Walker. And we slowly see like the spirit take over Glenn Turman's body, because of course, the title JD's Revenge, he's got some shit because this guy killed his sister, but then the motherfucker that was in love with his sister, played by Lou Gossett, thinks that he's the one that killed her, and then they off him, and then all kinds of like secrets and bullshit that have been going on for like 30 40 years. And so what's brilliant though is like, and I've heard this movie like labeled as one of the worst movies of all time. I think that's erroneous because and granted, it some of the acting may not be the best, but Glenn Turman is putting in fucking work. For as many movies as I've seen about like demonic possession or whatever the fuck, this one is very well done and executed. Very interesting concept, and the way it goes back and forth and stuff, it's pretty brilliant. Some of the shit, the movie's very funny too, for as dark and edgy as it is, and we kind of see his slow descent into that. There may be some kind of silly moments in it, but like I said, Glenn Turman is putting in work. Like I've never really seen somebody play it like that as well, and it is as cool. Like it is one of those that the payoff is really good. Like I said, the title is called JD's Revenge, so you really expect like some badass revenge shit. And you see like him just be his like fucking crazy self, and the way it taunts him in the mirror and shit. It's a pretty brilliant stuff. And that fucking ending where it's like all that shit is revealed, and like Lou Gossett fucking loses his shit, and it's just there's a certain intensity that in simplicity type thing. Like I said, Arthur Marx was one of the best at making not blaxploitation films, and this is like. And also, as far as a staple of black horror films, this one's up there. And, we also have, in a similar manner, we have Ernest Dickerson's Bones, which has Snoop Dogg in it as a kind of a similar situation. Jimmy Bones was a, kind of a protector of the neighborhood, but then he gets double crossed by his brother and a corrupt cop. And so, like, for 30 years or, 20 years, he's been in the house. Then it's like his tomb and basically the city of the dead type thing, and then these group of ambitious musicians decided to open a club. They build a club out of what used to be his house and stuff, and then their spirits unleashed through all this shit, and now he's getting his revenge and stuff. And they're pretty cool effects and stuff, but honestly there's not really much as far as like just having an iconic figure like Snoop Dogg, and like Pam Grier's in this as well. It kind of leans more towards, just being kind of resting on its laurels as like for who's in it and stuff. For as badass as Snoop Dogg is in this movie, he's nowhere near putting in the level of work that Glenn Turman's putting in for JD's Revenge. Yeah, motherfucker looks badass and cool. Of course he's going to because he's Snoop Dogg, and Pam Grier looking as fine as ever in this one. Definitely aging gracefully into like the kind of shit that she was made notable for, because like one of the first blaxploitation movies she was in, of course, was a Scream, Blackula Scream, and of course a lot of nods to the old school horror and stuff, but it just doesn't really pack that punch that JD's Revenge does, because a lot of even the climax of Bones kind of feels like recycled Freddy Krueger shit, whereas like JD's Revenge, watching Glenn Turman's character is J.D. Walker just like lose his shit when like the whole group of the family, you know, the guy that killed his sister, and then the court, which was also, you know, the Lou Gossett's brother in the movie, and then the daughter, and then they're just all wrestling with the gun. He's just maniacally laughing, and it's like, you know, I've never really seen that shit in a movie before, you know, and it's like, you know, fresh, original shit, you know, and that's what JD's Revenge was like. Bones is like, you know, I've really seen this in a lot, you know, it's just not as like, not as much fucking intensity and passion in it and stuff, and it's like, you know, like I said, we've seen all this shit before. It's just, you know, let's throw an iconic, you know, iconic person like Snoop Dogg in there, you know, and it's gonna be badass, you know, it's just not. And, you know, Ernest Dickerson is no slouch as a director either. You know, I mean, he one of the many directors that came up as a cinematographer. Of course, he did a lot of Spike Lee's early stuff, you know, but by this point in his career, you know, he just kind of, you know, it's not as fresh as like something like Juice or Surviving the Game. But, you know, of course, Arthur Marks, real brilliant director. So it's looking like JD's Revenge gets this round, you know, for anybody keeping score. That's 26-24. The 70s are up by 2. You know, like I said, the 70s, man, they keep coming back. I mean, it's such an iconic decade, the greatest decade in American cinema, in my opinion. Trying to strive to find the fact on that one, you know. So we still got a lot more of these to go. That's why these bonus rounds like this will pop up and stuff. But, you know, watching something like JD's Revenge, like your mind is just blown, you know, the level of intensity and the places that they were willing to go, you know, which is what exploitation cinema in the 70s was. It's like they didn't give a fuck. They just went for it. Whereas in Bones, there's a lot of other places that you could go. You know, there's a lot of like, you know, superficial shit, like, you know, Pam Grier, like, you know, sacrificing herself to say there's like some kind of eternal love type thing, you know. It's like all that shit's, you know, kind of bullshit. Whereas, like, you know, and I mean, you can even interpret, you know, the ending of JD's Revenge, you know, after all said and done, the shit gets explained to you. And honestly, like, you know, we see it all happen, and the fact that it's explained to the cops and they're all just kind of, so it's like, I'm good with that, because they know nobody's gonna believe that shit. But if, you know, they got a plausible deniability type thing, you know, and you know, for many movies that have explained their shit, JD's Revenge does it in such a way that it's, you know, wraps it up nicely, and, you know, you can't really be mad at it, because like I said, Glenn Turman putting in work, one of the best performances I've ever seen of somebody being possessed, and, you know, just a real original film. So 70s, you know, they're up by 2, man. They coming back. Can't fuck with the 70s. So if anything I've said you didn't like or you disagree with, you know, or it was wrong, let me know in the comments. I don't give a fuck. This is a rough draft to a doctoral thesis on like which decade's better, the 70s or the 90s. You know, honestly, it's just a retrospective on both of these great decades, but, you know, there has to be a winner. You know, there's only one winner and one loser, but who really loses when you're watching movies? So, you know, the next main event we'll have is the Swinging Cheerleaders versus Bring It On, and of course these bonus rounds will pop up here and there, so straight up sizzling, you know.